Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. I'm going to see if I can contact Anthony purely using the power of telekinesis today. Anthony, don't be scared if this voice has just popped inside your head, but can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Wow.
That is very strange.
That was easier than I thought. We've just, another first on our show. We've proof that telekinesis can work.
Well, every episode needs to have something special about it, yeah.
It does, yeah. I hope all is well with you.
Yeah, pretty good. Life is going on as usual.
The Earth continues to spin. We've been talking about doing a show on Dyatlov Pass for many, probably years now, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since the start, I think.
Yeah.
It's something that I think it's fascinated me for a long time, and you too, I guess.
It's a spooky and fascinating story, and we did at one point consider going to Dyatlov, didn't we?
We did, yeah. And I think we're going to talk to someone today who actually did that last summer.
We are indeed. We're going to talk to him in about 15 minutes. I thought we could give a brief background to the mystery. Over that year or two period where we've been talking about doing a show, we have looked at the story, but we probably have sort of rushed a bit today and haven't really refreshed our memories. But I hope we can basically between us remember enough anyway.
Well, yeah. It's a very complex story. But basically, what it boils down to is a kind of hiking expedition gone wrong. Dyatlov is the Dyatlov Pass is the full name of the place. It's in the Northern Ural Mountains, which is in Russia. If you look at the Crimean Peninsula, then you look southeast across the narrow part of the Black Sea. You see Sochi, where they had the Winter Olympics a few years ago, and if you look kind of north from there, you'll see two other Russian cities, Krasnodar and Stavropol. And they form a sort of triangle. And Dyatlov is kind of roughly in the center of that triangle. So it's kind of southwestern Russia, not far north of the Caucasus Mountains. And this place where this mystery occurred, its traditional name is Kholat Siachel, which means dead mountain. But the mountain pass was changed. The name of it was changed in 1959 to honor a guy called Igor Dyatlov, and he was quite a young man, but an experienced mountain hiker. So, in late January of 1959, he led a party of other hikers, all again quite experienced, on an expedition through this area. They were headed for a place called Otorten.
Yes, indeed. I was about to say, I noticed that you're kind of impersonating someone who's got a cold to give the more atmosphere to this story, as the temperature was negative 25 to negative 30 degrees in February 1959, right?
It was very cold indeed. Yeah. So they about a week after they'd kind of left civilization, as it were. They found themselves camped in a mountain pass. They hadn't planned to get there, but they'd kind of gotten slightly lost because of bad weather conditions, and they found themselves higher up than they thought, so they decided to make camp up there in the pass.
And this was originally 8 men and 2 women, but I think one of them went home, didn't he, early?
Yeah, that's right. There's a 10th hiker, which we can talk about a little later, because that's a story in itself, really. So they were camped up in this pass on the night of February 2nd, and something extremely strange and terrible happened. There were no surviving eyewitnesses, so exactly what happened does remain the subject of kind of speculation and some debate. But whatever it was, tragically, it killed all of the 9 hikers that were there. And this became very famous in the USSR, and actually it's still famous. I mean, if you go out into the street and kind of in a Western country and ask a random person, what's Dyatlov, they'll look at you blankly. But if you do the same in most ex-Soviet countries, almost for certain, the person you ask will know exactly what you're talking about. So you could say it's kind of like the Bermuda Triangle or the Loch Ness of the ex-USSR. Yeah.
To be fair though, if you go out into the street and ask anyone in the West a question, they tend to look at you blankly anyway.
Okay, that's arguable, but yeah.
That's a bit harsh, yeah.
But possibly the main reason why it's so famous is that the Soviet authorities investigated this incident after it happened, and what they found up there was, well, very bizarre to say the least. First of all, it took almost a month for the search and rescue teams from the army and the police force to find the campsite. And when they found it, the tent which the hikers had been in was empty. They'd apparently abandoned it, and they'd left all their belongings in there, and it was severely damaged. They found a huge hole in the side or the back, and it looked as though they'd cut the tent open from the inside to make a quick exit, but that implied that they couldn't go out through the front, which is very weird.
It is weird,
And weirder, although it was snowing and they were on a mountain in a storm, basically, most of them left without footwear. They were barefoot or they were only wearing socks. So clearly something was compelling them to get out of the tent as fast as they could.
And partially clothed as well.
Yeah, that's right. There were 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent, so obviously everybody had left. Yeah, and investigators followed the footprints across the Dyatlov Pass and into a wood, which was about 1.5 kilometers away. At the edge of the wood, under a tree, they found the bodies of 2 of the hikers, a man and a woman, who'd made a fire there and had been sitting around the fire, and they were wearing only underwear in, as you said, minus 25, minus 30 degrees. They were sitting, as I said, under a tree, and the tree had branches broken on it up to a height of about 5 meters, and the flesh on their hands was kind of all pulpy around their fingertips. Later on, there was a forensic investigation, and they found skin fibers embedded in the bark of the tree. So the 2 dead people had apparently climbed this tree in a panic, maybe to escape from something or get a better view of the area, possibly to see the camp, to see the other hikers. We don't know. Then the investigators combed back over the same ground. They found 3 more bodies there, including the body of Igor Dyatlov, who led the expedition. And the positions of those bodies suggested they were trying to get back to the campsite when they died. You know? There were medical examinations. There were no injuries found on any of these 5 bodies. So the examiners decided they'd all died of hypothermia. Yeah, but then things got weirder. It took an extra 2 months to find the other 4 hikers, even though they were only another 75 meters away from the camp. They were found in a ravine, and they'd made a shelter in the ravine. They were much better dressed than the other 5, and in fact, there was some indications that the other 5 hikers, those found in March, they'd given some of their clothes to these 4. They had other people's clothing wrapped around them. Yeah.
Or maybe they'd taken them. I think there was some speculation that the previous 2 died before, and they'd obviously taken some of the clothes in order to try and survive themselves.
Yeah. And these people, I mean, unlike the first 5 who were not injured, these people had extreme injuries, fatal injuries. One of them had major skull damage. 2 had major chest fractures, and one of them was found to have her tongue removed. Her tongue was missing. The investigator said that the force required to cause such damage to human bodies would have been extremely high. So it wasn't, a bear or something. It was something very, very serious.
And in fact, I think the investigation team came to the conclusion that an unknown compelling force had caused the deaths.
That's right. Yeah, the bodies had no external wounds at all, and this was the phrase they used: an unknown compelling force. And that phrase, I think, became central to the mystery, because they just couldn't work out how these people died. It was as if they were crippled by pressure.
There was also a trace of radiation on some of the bodies.
Yeah, that's right. Their clothes, some of the clothes that they put on to keep warm, were radioactive. It's something which has inspired a lot of speculation, and I don't think anyone has been able to say at any point the mystery is now closed. Yeah,
no, that's right.
But other theories have come up around the event. There was an idea that the hikers annoyed the local tribesmen. The the pass is in an area that's inhabited by the Mansi people, who have a language distantly related to Hungarian, strangely. But that didn't seem to really explain things because of the nature of their injuries. There have been extraterrestrial theories.
Well, there were some orange spheres seen in the sky by some other climbers on the same night, and by multiple witnesses actually. Yeah.
Yeah, there were theories about military tests in the area. One theory I remember reading suggested that the Soviet authorities were experimenting with infrasound, and that something like this may have happened. It was reported that the victims had a strange orange tan and grey hair, which I'm sorry, but can't help but make me think of the current president-elect of the USA. But anyway, never mind. But their bodies had a strange orange kind of tinge to them. And yes, there were reports of orange spheres seen in the sky.
There were a lot of people have come up with their own different theories, and there was secrecy around the event because files about the investigation were locked away into a secret archive for many years.
That's right.
Only became available in the 1990s. And not all of them either. This sort of helped to turn it into more of a conspiracy mystery kind of situation. Yeah,
that's right. And the area itself, I mean, this I guess has intensified the mystery and how this has drawn people in. The area itself is shrouded in some mystery. The Mansi people believe that that the area is kind of sacred, and you could say cursed if you wanted to use a kind of Western term, but their equivalent of that. And there's a particular thing that they have. They're into kind of numerology. There's a particular thing that they have about the number 9. Now, this occurred in 1959 and involved 9 hikers, right? The Mansi people say that there was a spiritual battle on that mountain pass 200 years earlier between 9 of their strongest warriors and dark spirits. And the 9 warriors were slain by the spirits, I think. And then there was a crash. There was an air crash there in the 1990s in which 9 people died. So it's there are all kinds of strange twists and turns like this to this mystery.
And some other explanations are avalanche. There are some reasons why that doesn't look incredibly likely, but maybe we'll talk to our guest about that. Yetis, or some kind of beast that attacked them, or animals. Indeed, it could be a combination of some of these theories. And hypothermia was definitely part of the reason for some of their deaths, anyway. But what caused them to run out of their tent in such a panic is one of the big mysteries.
Yeah, that's right. There was a novel actually written about this, a kind of fictionalized version. A guy who was called, wait a second, I think he was one of the official photographers of the original inquest, and he wrote a novel about it much later. His name was Dyatlov. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he actually wrote 2 versions of it, so as to kind of apparently so as to give the authorities a choice between to decide which was the less kind of contentious, and both were declined for publishing due to censorship. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting situation. And as I said before, it's very famous within the ex-Soviet Union, and it does remain a mystery to this day. I think it was in 2013, the 13th hiker died. Sorry, the 10th hiker. The 10th hiker died.
That's right, yeah. So there's fewer and fewer people actually involved in the story left alive, from the search party as well.
That's right. And these were all young, kind of sporty, athletic, almost kind of classic Soviet archetypes. These people, when you see photos of the expedition, they really look like the kinds of people that were front and center in the way the USSR kind of wanted to envision itself and its people. They were young, they were strong, they were They were experts in their field. And so again, that only intensified the mystery. How could these
exactly?
kind of
Yeah, they weren't amateurs at climbing or anything like that. These guys knew what they were doing.
No, they were the best and brightest, and like the kind of part of that generation, which were the future of the USSR at that point.
Indeed. Let's go over to our guest now, anyway. So, Keith McCloskey wrote Mountain of the Dead, the Dyatlov Pass Incident initially, and more recently, Journey to Dyatlov Pass, an explanation of the mystery. Keith has also been to Dyatlov Pass. I think he went there last year. He was born in Ireland, grew up in Africa, and spent time living and working in the Middle East. His parents both worked in aviation. He's written books about aviation and some other mysteries as well. He's appeared on radio shows such as Coast to Coast, where I think I may have actually heard him once, because that's where I heard about Dyatlov initially. He's also been on the National Geographic Channel and had an article featured in the Daily Mail about Dyatlov as well. Welcome, Keith, to Truth Sentinel.
Yep, thanks very much, Scott. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And my first question really is, how did you first come to get interested in Dyatlov Pass?
Well, it was a bit of an accident, really. I've been sort of very interested in Soviet military history for many years now, and one of the theories that came up, because I correspond with people all over the world and in Russia, on aviation matters, and one of them had told me about the story of the Dyatlov incident in relation to the possibility that there were two Soviet nuclear bombers had overflown the pass that night. And that's how I got to first hear of it. I included that particular theory in my first book, that they passed over the Dyatlov Pass that night heading north from their base in the Ukraine. And they were either dropping free-fall bombs or air mines, parachute mines, which explode with tremendous power above the ground, and that's been given as one of the possibilities, for the injuries of part of the group. It's just a theory, but that's how I got into it anyway.
Okay, great. So I was going to ask you about your trip actually last year. Me and Anthony were at one point thinking of doing the same ourselves, but I think we chickened out. It must have been quite a scary experience camping in the same spot, wasn't it, when you went camping last year?
Yeah, it was. It was such a weird feeling. We went south from the village of Ushma. We were south. Well, they didn't get to Ushma. They went a slightly different route, but we travelled south of the actual route they took from the abandoned village, the geologist settlement. And we went along the river Auspia and ended up where they had camped not on the final night, the night before they went up onto the mountain. But it was a very, very, well, I don't know how you can describe it. You have to be there really to get the feeling of it. But it was a strange place. It certainly had a kind of atmosphere about it for me. And Yuri Kontsevich of the Dyatlov Foundation said to me when we were pitching the tents and laying out the sort of communal seating area, he said, we're now on the same spot that the group were on their second last night. So, and then they went up onto the ridge, up into the pass, and we followed that same route. But quite an experience, I have to say.
Yeah, and I looked at some of the videos and photos on your site, and it doesn't look like it was an easy trip either. Lots of mud and difficult terrain to get across, yeah?
Well, I thought I was quite fit. I mean, I'm not a young man anymore, but I spent half my life in a gym. But I'll tell you, I was not prepared for that. I thought just a pair of ordinary climbing boots would do the job, but I was told before we left Yekaterinburg I would need to get a pair of Wellingtons. But it was like an assault course is about the only way I can describe it. You had 55 pounds I was carrying on my back, 25 kilos. I'd been training on a cross trainer, but and there was a hell of a pace that was set. I mean, obviously people were younger than me, but as I say, I'd been training for about 6 or 8 months in the gym before I went, and I was struggling to keep up. and you were constantly having to climb over trees, and not just small trees, huge trees that were the width of them were as tall as you were, that had fallen over onto the trail. So you either tried to go under them if you could, which isn't easy with a backpack, or you were trying to climb over them. And it was just mud everywhere. And when I say mud, not mud you skidded in, mud you sank into up to your thighs. I actually got stuck in what I couldn't get out of the mud I went into. And one of the guides had to come and sort of help, dig away the mud and pull me out. I was literally stuck fast in it. It was a really tiring trip. You've got to be in pretty good shape to do it, I would say, if anybody's thinking of having a go at it. But the thing is, they did it in winter, but that required even more fitness because they were carrying heavier loads. The two females in the group, apparently their backpacks were 60 kilos, and the guys were carrying, I think it was not 60 kilos, sorry, 60 pounds, or 66 pounds. The guys were carrying 88 pounds, 40 kilos. So, and they were in extremely good shape. But it would be harder to do it in winter, I reckon.
Yeah, maybe it's a good thing we didn't go, Anthony.
Maybe so.
You should. I mean, if you have a great interest in it, it's a hell of an experience because it's not easy to get to. If you get a number 37 bus up there, every man and his dog would be there. But it's. I can imagine. I had to take nearly 3 weeks holiday or not holiday, but 3 weeks to allow for time in Yekaterinburg to do interviews and see people, and then the trip up there because you have to take it's from same distance as London to Edinburgh, and then you've got the a long haul into the mountains. And we were up there for 10 days, so you've got to allow. There's not many people are going to take 2 or 3 weeks holiday just think, oh, I'm interested in the Dyatlov Pass, I'd love to go and see it. So you've got to be committed, but it's worth it when you get there, I think.
Yeah, and do you think the trip sort of helped open up any more possibilities to what happened, or did they cross any off the list for you in particular?
Yeah, one very much in particular was the avalanche. When we stood at the site of where the tent is, and there's a lot of disputes about where the tent actually was, but I would think it was in more or less the right place when you look at the photos. I don't think it was under the path of the mountain. It was further out on the ridge. But standing there and looking at the top of the ridge, no way could an avalanche have caused them to run from the tent. You'll get sort of some survivalists read the story and say, oh, it's got to be an avalanche, but it wasn't just my opinion. Just about everybody there said that there's no way an avalanche could have caused them to run from the tent. It was just the slope was so close, the top of the ridge was very close, and you'll see it. I mean, I don't think it shows it that well in the pictures. It would have been better to have had somebody on the ridge for scale, so you get an idea of how close it was, but it certainly wasn't far. And it was fairly shallow. I mean, it can't have been more than about 15 to 18 degrees. So you think, well, even if there was snow on it and it did move, it can't have moved much. And I mean, there's been some of the Russian, survival experts have said that there's no history of avalanches up there. And apparently the way the prevailing wind blows, it blows the snow off the top of the ridges anyway, so there isn't a great deal of snow there. I mean, that for me really sort of, if you like, disproved the avalanche theory. And not just me, but there was a guy who was a photojournalist from Moscow with us, and he said there's no way that an avalanche would have happened here. And the other interesting thing about not the mountain itself, but the sites, we went over the sites where the bodies were found, and there was a lot of logic in what they did, in that they went straight down the mountain. But in one of the search party, they had somebody had drawn a rough hand-drawn map, and it said there was 75 meters between where the shelter had been built and where the cedar tree was. But they were actually so close together. It was barely 75 feet. I mean, 75 meters is about 230 feet, I think it is. The distance, you could literally walk up the slope of the ravine to the cedar tree in just a minute or two. Yeah, and I could have talked to people in the snow shelter from where I stood at the cedar tree. So the thing is, one thing I've found through the years is people get distances very mixed up. The distances and weights. People will guess at something. It's like if you do your your eye test for a drive. They take your test you for your driving test. And you say, how far is that license plate away? A lot of people don't really get the idea of distance. So it was interesting to find that there were actually the people who, Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, who were found at the cedar tree, were very close to the other four who were in the snow shelter. Not a great distance away at all, because that was one of the queries I had about the whole thing is why would they were seriously injured, so why would you leave them almost on their own and be so far away from them? You'd think you'd want to be closer to them, which they were. So there was a lot of logic to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Just moving back to your books, I've started reading your second book, but can you tell us what the difference was between your second book, which is about this trip that you're talking about at the moment, and the first book?
Well, the first book was just to introduce the story. My first book was the first written outside Russia on the Dyatlov incident. It's been followed by 4 or 5, possibly 6 more since then. And in the time since I wrote that, I think there's been another 4 books in Russia written on it, in Russian, of course. But it was just to introduce the story. The second book was to describe what it was like up there and the journey, a kind of travel book in a way, the first half. And in the second half, I introduce some new research that's been done on the lights in the night sky. I also include the full article written by Lev Ivanov, who, as you know, was investigating the case. And I also include 2 interviews by his boss, who has never been mentioned before in any of the other books. And what he had to say is quite interesting. And he's still alive. I think he was 93 when he gave the interview in 2013, and he lives in Moldova. But I would suggest, obviously I want to sell a book, but I would strongly suggest that you have a read of what he says and make your mind up as to whether the authorities are actually covering anything up or not.
So Lev Ivanov, he was in charge of the original inquest, is that right?
Well, he was the prosecutor. He was investigating. The original person assigned to investigate the case was a prosecutor by the name of Tempelov from Ivdel, which was the nearest town, if you like. It's about 80 miles away from the Dyatlov Pass. Now, he was removed from the investigation, and Lev Ivanov was placed not so much in charge, but to do the day-to-day running, because the name Lev Ivanov is given as the man who was in charge of the case. He wasn't. The actual man in charge of the case on a day-to-day basis was named Okishev, and it's his interview that I've given. And he is also interviewed by a current lawyer in Russia as to anomalies in the case. But it's very interesting what Lev Ivanov says in his article in 1990 and what his boss says in 2013.
That sounds intriguing. And why was that investigator removed that you mentioned just then?
Well, he was a junior. I mean, he was just, I don't know. Imagine how can we put it into context? Imagine you're in, I don't know, the boondocks somewhere. I don't want to insult anybody, hillbilly country or something. You can't say anything these days for insulting some group. But you're in up in the hills somewhere. There's some kind of tragedy. Inspector Bob Smith of the local constabulary, he gets involved, and somebody says, well, we need someone with more experience. I mean, Lev Ivanov was, if you like, a big city cop, the Sverdlovsk as it was then. I think it's the fourth biggest city in Russia. So they're sending up with somebody with a lot of experience, as opposed to somebody who's dealing with, the odd case of wife beating in Ivdel or the odd murder or whatever. But, it's very low level stuff. I think they wanted somebody who, could bring a lot more to the case than somebody who didn't have a hell of a lot of experience. But having said that, it was a case that was highly unusual anyway.
Yeah,
and Ivanov, he published an article about the incident in 1990, which I think you were mentioning before. But then there were two other investigators who got access to his file on the investigation in around 2008, 2009, and they found an image, a photograph that had been taken by one of the hikers inside the tent. Yeah, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I wonder about the veracity of that image, because the photographs, the actual negatives, are all held by the foundation, the Dyatlov Foundation, and there's nothing that's inside the tent. You see, part of what's happened over the years is there's a lot of what's the word?
Disinfo.
Yeah, that's probably one way of putting it. For instance, when I was over there, Yuri Kontsevich was saying that somebody had produced a piece of cloth from which had been removed from the archives of the KGB, and it was part of the tent, and it showed that there was blood on it. And I mean, that's been proven to be disinformation. It was proven to be completely false, and there's a lot of that out there. And when you're talking about Lev Ivanov's file, I'll refer you back to. Obviously, I want to sell my book, and I don't want to give too much away. But what happened was the original case file didn't stay in Sverdlovsk. It was removed by somebody who arrived from Moscow, and I give his name and all the details of how he behaved with them when he arrived, and he shut the whole investigation down.
So you spoke to Kontsevich, yeah?
He was one of the.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you carry on.
We'll probably edit that bit. He was one of the two researchers who gained access to Ivanov's archives in 2009. It was. Yeah. So you talked to him at length, I guess. Yeah.
I do, yeah, and I regularly correspond with him as well.
Okay. And what's his theory about this? What does he think happened?
Well, he keeps his options open like I do, but his view strongly is that the military are involved. Although, like I say, he's like me; he's willing to listen to any theory on it. But he spends time up at the pass. He goes up every year, and we were hoping this year to go to the Chistop Massif, which is a mountain top. It's it's not just a mountain top; it's a whole range to the east. It's about 30 to 40 miles away from the Dyatlov Pass, and there was a radar station up there. From what I've been able to find out, it was there from 1972 to 86. But there seems to be he's found missile fragments up there. It looks like the military have been making use of it. And Yuri has a letter from the authorities in Yekaterinburg, as it is now, confirming that the place was declared radiation-free in 2002. So what lies behind that, you have to work out yourselves, I suppose.
Another guy who seems to favour the idea of military involvement is Yuri Yudin, who died in 2013, I believe. He was the 10th hiker who pulled out of the expedition due to illness at the last minute, and he seems to have believed all along that there was some kind of military involvement. Yeah? When we say like military involvement, what kind of thing are we talking about here? What are the military alleged to have been doing in that area?
Well, the trouble is, to me, it could be one of two or three things. The Urals itself is a very sensitive area because after the war, everything was moved. Well, and during the war, they moved all the tank production, east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of the Germans, and basically everything stayed there and built up. There's a nuclear weapons, nuclear warhead storage facility 70 miles south of the Dyatlov Pass. And there's tank factories, there's a plutonium processing plant on the way up there as well. The whole area is a very sensitive. There's large areas as a foreigner you cannot be seen to be found in. They're demarcated by map coordinates, and if you're found within them, you'll be arrested. But so it's all very sensitive. So when you say the military, it seems to me that what they would be doing would be trying to protect that. So the most obvious thing is air defense. I can't imagine that, you'd be having military exercises, ground exercises up there, because you wouldn't expect an invading force to come that way. And I'm not saying you don't take troops into the mountains and do mock battles or fight or whatever, but it seems to me that whatever it is connected with air defense. There was an air base to the east of the Dyatlov Pass, about 100 miles away. And on the in my book, I show some of the research that's been done by Valentin Yakimenko, who knew the group. He took over as chairman of the sports club at the university the year after the deaths, and he's done a lot of research on the negatives, the seemingly blank negatives, but he's used a powerful microscope to examine them. He's removed the dirt and specks of whatever that were found on them. He's cleaned them up, but what he's come out with is what looks like something going on in the night sky that the group had been photographing. At least 3 of the cameras were photographing something happening in the night sky. But the trouble is, even if you say, okay, they were there on the mountain that night, they were photographing something strange in the night sky, it doesn't necessarily prove that that's what killed them.
Well, that's true. That is true, yeah. And I mean, we have to think too. It's 1959. This was sort of, I mean, in the West, in the US, this was sort of the golden age of flying saucer theories, I suppose.
That's right.
And I think at that point, that was actually, I think, before. Interestingly, if you look back at the history of this kind of UFO phenomenon in the West, in the 40s and 50s, it wasn't in any way kind of hidden. Like governments were setting up agencies to try and find out what it was, and publicly announcing what they'd found. Yeah? So that was really, I mean, that was the time when we were in the thick of what you might call UFO fever. But a lot of those things, a lot of them remain unexplained. At the same time, a lot of them have been explained as military tests and things like this. So, but if it's near a nuclear facility, if there is a nuclear storage facility not far away, and an airfield also not far away, then I think that does lend weight to the idea that there's some kind of air defense thing involved. But could the nuclear facility explain the irradiated state of some of the hikers' clothing, do you think?
Well, I've wondered about that, but you see, the trouble is, if there'd been some kind of leak, it's a very large area when you look at it on Google Earth. I don't speak Russian, and I think everybody'd laugh if I tried to pronounce it, but there's 2 names for it, but Lesnoy is probably the easiest one, Lesnoy. Is how it's spelled in our alphabet, but that's, as I say, to the south. So if there's a leak from there, surely the whole area would have been affected by it. Because it looked to me as if when you read about the radiation aspect of it, they're talking about the final 4 bodies. So surely the thing to do would have been the funerals had already happened. So why not dig up the other bodies to see if they'd been affected as well? But that didn't happen. And when you think there'd be radiation all over the place,
Yeah,
it seemed to
true.
be something
True.
very localized.
Do you think it's likely that there's a combination of some of the theories, like for example the tongue being missing on one of the women was always kind of very spooky part of the story, but do you think that probably was animals that sort of had been sort of devouring parts of this woman's body?
Yeah, I've consulted. So to me, that tongue business is a bit of a red herring. It's just my view on it, but I say it in my book. To me, there were a number of red herrings put into the autopsies, and I believe that's one of them. I've actually consulted a few pathologists on this, including one in Canada who specialises in cold weather deaths. And his view was that it might have, some people say she was lying in the stream, so maybe it was microorganisms, but his view was that it might have been something slightly larger. I don't know, maybe mice that had come out of hibernation or whatever, if the tongue's missing. But it's not just the tongue, it's the whole root as well. So it's not something that you could cut out or whatever. But I wonder about all the autopsies for two reasons. One of them, the head of the Sverdlovsk prosecutor department, Thinov, he actually travelled up to Ivdel to be present at the autopsies of the first five bodies, which is a highly unusual move, according to Okishev, which he said in his interview. He said it was very rare for him to actually go to an autopsy, let alone one that's 400 miles away. And at this point, these bodies had been found supposedly dead of hypothermia. So why would he travel 400 miles north just to be present at some people who died of misadventure, if you like? It was highly unusual. So that implies that there's knowledge of what had happened, that something else had happened for him to go up there, if you like, to make sure that the right story was being given in the autopsy. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, if you've probably read it in my first book, that there was an outbreak of anthrax from a military biological warfare establishment in Yekaterinburg itself. It was Sverdlovsk then, but that was in 1979. And what happened was the KGB went around the hospitals. There was nearly 100 people died from it, from breathing in the spores. And the KGB went around the hospitals and confiscated all the medical records and then had them reissued to show that it was death by eating contaminated meat, not inhalation, which of course points to biological warfare. And they were a contravention of the 1972 agreement with the Convention on Biological Warfare Weapons. So they're quite capable of changing, the Soviets were quite capable of changing medical records if it suited an agenda. People would say, well, why would they do that? And I would say, well, because they didn't want the truth to be known for a particular reason.
It does seem, though, that they ran out of the tent pretty quickly, though, so that would kind of lend itself more to seeing strange lights or hearing something strange, wouldn't it?
Well, the thing with the running out is, if you read the reports of all the search parties, the footsteps were all at walking pace. So it seems weird to slash your way out of a tent and then walk down the mountain. If there's, I don't know, for argument's sake, a Yeti is chasing you, or there's a huge avalanche coming behind you, neither of which are that plausible. But say that's what was happening, you wouldn't slash your way out and then just calmly walk down the rest of the mountain. So that doesn't make sense either.
Yeah, and that also makes you think, well, if the military were involved, they weren't actually physically probably there with them. It would be maybe an explosion nearby or something that scared them.
That's what I believe. What I believe. My view is that if there were explosions, Zolotarev had been he'd been in the military and he'd fought on the Eastern Front in Stalingrad, and he would be aware if there was an explosion that there's probably going to be more, and may have said, let's get get down to the tree line pretty quick, so you wouldn't necessarily run. He may have said something like, "We need to get out of here now," and down to the trees, where at least if there was going to be shrapnel or blast, you'd be a bit safer, because you're not going to be safe in a tent or in the open.
Something that's always puzzled me is the hole in the tent, because presumably the tent would have had an entrance at the front. So if there was not a desperate hurry to get out, why not just go out through the front of the tent?
Well, that's true, but the old style Soviet tent wasn't a zip up thing like you would take on holiday with you. These were buttoned with a kind of a flap over the button, so it would take you time to unbutton it all. If, say, there was an explosion, if you're in a tent and there's an explosion, it would frighten you. You'd probably slash your way straight out, and then be alarmed enough to say, "What the hell's going on?" Go out the fastest way possible, and then try and take stock of what was happening, with the possibility. And then they see the lights in the sky and think, "Well, we probably walked into the middle of a military exercise here. We'll start making our way down to the tree line, walking reasonably fast, but not running necessarily, but realizing they were in extreme danger." But you see, also, the other thing about the damage to the tent is the rescuers made the holes bigger using their pickaxes. That's been admitted that I think it was Yuri Koptilov, I can't remember off the top of my head, who had used his pickaxe and torn the hole to make it bigger so he could get in to see what was there, because it was in a collapsed state. But don't forget also at that point that they weren't expecting to find dead bodies. They just thought, well, the tent's a bit of a mess. We can always get a new one. Let's go and see where they all are. They've obviously moved away from it. They weren't expecting to find anybody dead, so they probably weren't over bothered what they did to the tent or the surroundings. And that's part of the problem. Of course, nothing was preserved as it was found.
To go back to the autopsies for a second, we know that that this case is very famous in former Soviet countries. As it happens, I live in Kazakhstan, and I've also spent time in Russia and Ukraine, and I've asked various people about it just out of curiosity. Do you know about it? What do you think about it? And everybody knows about it. Everyone has heard of it in these countries, whereas in the West it's not very well known at all. I think it's becoming better known now, but my question was going to be, so it became well known, but was it a big story at the time? Did the kind of celebrity of this case, was it immediate or did it come later?
No. From what I can gather, it came later. But when it's strange the way the authorities reacted to it. You're living in Kazakhstan, so you probably have a knowledge of what the Soviet Union was like, where bad news was never welcome. They never used to report air crashes. Commercial airliner crashing was never officially reported. There's a case I remember reading in, I think, the early 80s or the late 70s. A couple were looking for their daughter, and they thought she'd been murdered or kidnapped. And after they investigated, she died on a commercial airliner flight to Moscow from, I can't remember where it was, somewhere like Novosibirsk or something. She died, was killed in the air crash along with, I think it was a Tu-154, and all the passengers were killed, but nobody was ever notified. It wasn't even in the papers. So there's this constant, if you like, I don't know, security for security's sake, or secrecy for the sake of secrecy. And when the burials, the funerals were taking place, all the students at the university were told by the lecturers that they're to attend their lectures and not to go to the funerals of the group, and they ignored it. The feelings were running pretty high within the university and all the students, because they were very popular. Most of them are pretty popular, and they wanted to show a kind of mark of respect. But so they defied the lecturers to go to the to attend the funeral. But there's this constant attempt by the authorities to play down the whole the whole thing. And it's strange that they should do that in a way, because you'd think, well, these are all highly respected young communists. They were good students. Zolotarev wasn't, well, they weren't all students either, but they were basically good young communists. So why an attempt to play down the deaths, if you like, which is the way the authorities seem to wanted to handle it. It was, look, it's business as usual. Let's carry on. When I on my first trip to Yekaterinburg, I went. There's a little museum in the university run by a couple of volunteers, and they have a thing every year called in May, which is all to do with sports and culture and what have you. That was. They didn't have that. That May that was cancelled as a kind of, I suppose, maybe a mark of respect. But the effect it had on everybody was quite a strong one. Difficult to describe how it must have affected everybody. But I think it's called something like Spring something. The celebration by the university, but the final 4 bodies were found at the beginning of May with the terrible injuries. So, and rumours start spreading pretty quick, and there was this attempt to try and dampen the whole thing down. But it certainly was. It's only after time has passed that it's become more and more well known. It certainly wasn't a massive, on the front page of Pravda or anything like that.
We're starting to get into our final few minutes now, actually. I just wanted to ask you, Keith, of all the theories you've heard and after your investigations, would you be able to narrow it down to sort of your top 3 theories that you think are the most likely?
Yeah, I still favour something to do with the military, because I can't understand why they wanted to close it down. The second one is possibly something to do with either prisoners or the Mansi. But the Mansi, if you read in my book, you'll see what Geny Okishev says about the Mansi, because he came up and interviewed one of their leaders, and it wasn't a sacred place. It points to something man-made. And I have to be honest, I'm starting to look at Mansi legends now as well, because none of the theories add up. I mean, you asked me for 3, and to be honest, the third one, the only thing that explains a slow walk down the mountainside, is something had affected them, whether it's chemicals or, infrasound or whatever. It's the only thing that would explain tearing your way out of the tent and then slowly walking away from it. Nothing adds up. Even if you leave out things to fit your favourite theory, nothing adds up about it.
No, do you think it ever will?
If you look in my book again, Yurakov, when he came, he shut the case down and he took the files away with him. So there may be something in Moscow, but nobody's talking, that's for sure. But I know people have even written to President Putin's office, and all that happens is it gets directed back to the local oblast, the administrators there, and they then write back and say this case was closed in 1959, and if anything further comes to light, we will reopen it. Yeah. I was going to say, Anthony, that secrecy and keeping your mouth shut are ingrained habits in that part of the world.
Yeah, and actually, I had one last question myself, which was, I had another question. I noticed a medium contacted you, and I just wondered what they had to say on the matter.
Well, I've written it all out. So not written it. I put she, it's a he actually, but I'll change that. But he has written an 11-page document as to what it sounds like. There was somebody outside the tent. The basic summary of it: somebody outside the tent speaking in foreign language, which could be Mansi. But have a read of it. I include everything on my website. Some people might scoff, say I don't believe in mediums. Well, that's up to them. I keep a very open mind on it, and I'll entertain any theory because, for the simple reason, nobody can prove their own.
Yeah, and can you give us details of those 2? I think it's 2 main websites you have, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one's called www.Dyatlov-Pass ural-incident.com.
Yeah.
And the other one is just my general author's website, Keith McCloskey, author.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been great chatting to you, Keith.
Lovely. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
All the best. Bye.
Bye-bye.